the Bible, specifically the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and ancient myth. So we're going to be thinking about the ways in which the practices and the narratives that we find in the Bible are similar to and different from the things that people in the cultures round about Israel in Old Testament times. So we're thinking, about between 2,000 years before Christ to 500 years before Christ, and thereabouts, 3,000 years before Christ potentially. How those events and practices that we read about in the Bible are different from and similar to the cultures like, the Babylonian culture, the Canaanite culture, the Hittites, the Amorites, and the peoples that lived in the region of the ancient Near East at that time. I think there was a time, perhaps quite a long time ago now, when the West was significantly more actively Christian than it is today, that it was kind of assumed that the things that we read about in the Old Testament or in the Hebrew Bible, that the things that the Jews did that are recorded there were unique, and that the cultures around were doing something that was quite different. And in some senses, that's true. But I think what we have discovered from discoveries in the 19th century, and in particular in the 20th century, both from archaeological discoveries of artifacts and from the texts that we've discovered from those surrounding cultures, is that there are more similarities in terms of the practices of those ancient peoples with what's recorded in the Bible than was once thought. And that gives rise to an interesting question then, because for the believer, that can lead to the question, well, perhaps the Bible isn't as unique. Perhaps what's recorded in the Bible isn't as unique as I'd once thought, and what do I do with that? And for the unbeliever or the skeptic, this can lead to a view of, oh, well, the things that are described in the Bible, it's not really that special. There's nothing to see here. It's not that interesting. It was just another ancient culture. The Babylonians had their gods, and the Hebrews had their God, and they were all basically doing the same thing. So we want to think about whether or not that is the case. So indeed, there are similarities, and I'm just going to share my screen at this point to illustrate one or two of those. So this is the question that we're looking at then. How different is the Old Testament to what others believed at the time? And let me take you to this slide first of all. So we read, for example, this is just to give some examples of what we're talking about here. We read, for example, in the Old Testament about the tabernacle and the temple, and we find that other ancient cultures in the region had buildings that had similarities in some respect to what we find in the tabernacle. In the cultures around, we read about mythical creatures, sea monsters and so on, called Leviathan, Rahab, stories about dragons and so forth. Well, there are allusions to these things in the Bible, although they're very much mentions in passing. But again, there are points of connection that scholars have made. We have the Law of Moses recorded in the Old Testament, but we've since discovered many other law codes of ancient peoples. To what extent are these similar or different? There are connections or similarities between some of the Psalms and Ugaritic poetry, Canaanite poetry that we've discovered at Ras Shamra back in 1917 or 27, I forget what, 1917, I think. Similarly, between some of the Proverbs in the Book of Proverbs or Song of Solomon and ancient Egyptian literature, some of the ritual, the sacrifices, the feasts recorded in the Law of Moses, we may find parallels in Canaanite or Babylonian culture. And so we could go on like that. The flood narrative in the Bible about Noah, there are other ancient cultures that had flood narratives. So to what extent are these similar and different? And by the title of this slide, I'm suggesting then that there are indeed surface similarities, and we've just rattled through a number of those, but underneath there are deep distinctions. There are deep differences, fundamental differences between what we have in the Bible and what was believed by the different peoples around. Now, of course, this is a very high level run through many things in the few minutes that we've got in this session. So, we won't be going into the details. And of course, I approach this with a particular view. I am a Christadelphian. I believe in the Bible. So, I do have an angle, if you like, on this. But I do feel that there is strong evidence when we look at these things a little bit more closely that there is indeed a difference. The Bible is unique, but the uniqueness is perhaps not quite the same as we might have thought it was, 100 or 200 years ago, let's say. And I'll illustrate what I mean by that as we go along. And it's a little bit like, if an alien were to come down from outer space and, look in the house of a Christadelphian and compare that to what goes on at, some other Christian group like the House of a Presbyterian or Church of England or something, or then even go to visit an atheist or visit a Jew, and they would see things. They would see lots of common elements. We might be sat there having dinner. I might go out and get in my car and drive to the supermarket, and the atheist does the same thing. Members of different Christian churches do the same thing. So there are certainly similarities, but there are also deep distinctions. The worldview that we might have might be very different. And I think, a committed atheist would want to claim, just as I would want to claim as a Christian, that there are deep fundamental differences in our way of looking at the world, even though there might be some aspects of our surface practice, like going out to the supermarket or driving a car, that look very similar. And I think it's similar to that when we compare the Bible with some of the things that we find in ancient cultures. It's worth just thinking about the function of myth. So just imagine for a moment that we live in ancient times in the ancient Near East, and we don't have the belief in an all-powerful, omnipotent God of the kind that we find in the Bible. So let's imagine we don't believe that, and I'm just there as a person in the ancient world, and there are powerful forces affecting my life, and it's critical to my life whether or not, what kind of weather patterns we have this year, and whether the harvest is going to be a successful one or whether it's not, because that's going to determine whether or not I can feed my family, whether or not we're going to survive. And so, whether there is a storm, whether there is a hurricane, whether it's a mild winter or not, all those things, whether a neighboring tribe or country invades or whether it doesn't, whether I fall in love or whether I have a marriage arranged for me, these things make a massive difference to me and my life, and I want to explain that roller coaster of existence that I have. And of course, there's my relationship as a human with nature, humans, and the interface with the natural world. But in order to seek to explain some of the seemingly chaotic forces, like whether we have a good harvest or not, and some of the experiences that I have, whether I or a family member become seriously ill or not, in order to rationalize and explain that, there is this tendency to tell stories about another realm, the divine realm, that interfaces or that mirrors my own world. And by telling stories about that world, that helps me to tell a narrative and to understand the experiences that I'm facing. So we can think of this, diagrammatically like this, by human world interfacing with the natural world, and then telling these mythological stories about a mirroring divine world in order to explain why it is that I have a particularly abundant crop and things are going well this year, or why my child has died, or whatever it might be. the purpose of myth is to ground and provide some kind of narrative about that, and not only so, by actually through magic and ritual, I might believe that I can actually influence that divine world to make things go better for me, so that my family member is healed, or so that we have a good harvest, or whatever it might be. And that then is the function of magic and ritual within that. I want to just briefly pay acknowledgement to this book, the Bible and Among the Myths, by John Oswalt. John Oswalt's a biblical scholar, an Old Testament or Hebrew Bible scholar. He wrote a big commentary on the book of Isaiah, for example. And he wrote this book, which I read a few years ago now. And, I'd individually looked at and studied, as part of my academic study and my own personal study, many of those different aspects of that list I showed a few slides ago, about points where there are similarities between the Bible and the cultures around. But it was really John Oswalt's book that sort of tied these things together and provided a very helpful framework, for me at least, in thinking about what underpinned that worldview of those cultures around the Bible and how the Bible was distinct from that. And I just want to show a couple of slides that relate to that. So let's just think for a minute about that, how that mythological world works, about what was happening in those cultures around. Well, of course, in those cultures, most of them, if not all of them, were polytheistic. So, there might be a god for the sun, a god of the mountain, a storm god, a god of love, all the strong human emotions, the things that affect health and human thriving or otherwise, and also the big natural phenomena, god of the ocean, perhaps. But those gods, there was really quite a low view of those gods. So they were seen really as kind of like large-sized human beings. They were involved in the same struggle to survive, the same fighting with one another for dominance, the same seeking for comfort and pleasure that we know so well as human beings. So that's very interesting, really, that the gods were seen quite differently to the way that the God of the Bible is viewed, in this lowly way, in this very human way. And why would that be? Well, because they were invoked in the first place in order to try to explain the things that were going on in the human world. There's this focus on the present. It's not really that there's a particular direction that human history is going in. Rather, it's about maintaining the status quo. There may be cyclicality in human experience, like the birth of and then the death of the moon, or the new year, or whatever it might be. But essentially, then through all the chaos through which the world comes into being, nature is invoked, and nature symbolism is invoked, and magic and ritual is performed in order to try to manipulate or align oneself with the gods, and to make that divine power available to you to maintain the status quo, to ensure you had a good harvest, and so on. Now, within all of that, not only is there a relatively low view of the gods being like large-sized people, there's also a low view of humanity, in which the choices I make don't really have any great bearing on anything in the big scheme of things. There is really a trivialization of personality and human empowerment. Humans are not empowered in this worldview. And of course, because there are many gods, so there is no single standard of ethics. And one of the quite attractive features of this, I suppose, is that to some degree you can have all these different gods and they all stand for different things, and you might be trying to placate a particular one at a particular point in time. Well, you can choose a god in your own image, can't you? You can choose something that feels right to you, that ties with the way in which you want to behave. Now, just to stop and as a quick aside for a minute, this feels like, well, this is a view of someone in the ancient world, and of course we don't think like this anymore, and that's true in some respects. But I do find it interesting that there are some ways in which this is reflective of a worldview that still is present in a way with the scientific worldview, in which, as part of the evolutionary narrative, we're told to think about, how human behavior is influenced by, our evolutionary past, as and this is how it's told, by the chimp brain or the reptile brain or whatever, and human beings are seeking their self-interest and then trying to maximize their comfort and their pleasure. And there is quite a low view of humanity, in the sense that, is there free will really, or are we just subject to, dancing to the drumbeat of our DNA? Are we dictated to by forces that it's very difficult for us to control, like our genetics, like our psychological makeup, like our socioeconomic background? Though in a way, those explanations, in a kind of way, reduce my agency to act for myself. And of course, increasingly, we live in this pluralistic society in which people believe that they're free to choose their own ethics and morality and how they'll behave. Now, if we compare that ancient view that the cultures around Israel would typically have had, and say, well, how is the worldview of the Bible different to that? Well, it's completely different. Instead of having these large-sized humans as gods, we have a God who is completely transcendent, who is all-powerful and all-wise, who stands outside of the world, the natural world and time, and brings the natural world into being and reveals himself to it. So the God that we meet in the Bible is not a God who is like a large-sized man or woman, but is rather a God of absolute characteristics, absolute wisdom and power, but also a God of mercy and truth, a God who can be trusted, who does not act capriciously, but who is reliable and who wants to make covenant with people, with human beings, who wants to make promises to them and engage with them. In contrast to the ancient myths, there is no conflict in the creative process, and there is no credible threat to God. So, for instance, whatever we think, or whoever we think the Satan in the book of Job in the Old Testament might be, there's no way in which the book of Job thinks that the Satan is any kind of credible threat to God, or that God is scared of him or dictated to by him in any way. God is all powerful. In contrast, other would-be gods, other idols must be broken or smashed, and God should not be represented by anything within the human world. Spiritual is more important than the natural, and there is, rather than that low view of humanity in which our decisions don't really make any great difference in the great scheme of things, the Bible's view and the Old Testament view, as well as the New Testament, has a very high view of humanity in which human actions and decisions matter. We are accountable for the decisions and the choices that we take. Couple other examples there. The point of the biblical narrative is that God has acted decisively in history, and that has made every difference in the world to what our lives might be like now, and that there is a very clear future ahead that God has promised, and that my conduct and my behavior matters in relation to that. So that's quite a high-level background to some of the philosophical differences, if you like, the worldview differences between the cultures around Israel, with their myths and narratives, and the perspective of the Bible in terms of what God is like and what human beings alike. What I'd like to do in the remainder of our time is just to take 4 examples. You remember earlier I gave a longer list of these are some of the points where things that we find in the Old Testament might look superficially or may have some similarities with things that we find in the cultures round about. But that, in fact, when we look closely, we find there are fundamental differences of worldview and perspective, and it's those that really matter. So let's then talk about these 4 things. So within the Old Testament, there is a set of laws or a law code known as the Law of Moses, and various parallels are found between some of the laws that are in there and some of the laws of the cultures around. And those parallels, that they are there, and why should they not be? It's perhaps no great surprise to find that there are similarities in laws that we find when we look across different cultures and across different times. And yet there are crucial distinctions as well between the Bible's approach to law and the cultures around. So what are some of those? Well, first of all, the Law of Moses is set in a very particular historical context, that God brings the Israelites who become his people, he brings them out of slavery in Egypt. He saves them from slavery, and then he gives them his law as part of a covenant and a set of promises that he makes to them. The law codes around tend to, amongst the nations around, and the vassal treaties that we find tend to be much more about one society conquering another and then subjecting it to its laws, rather than the law rooted in liberation that we find in the Old Testament. There are a lot more absolute laws, if you like, where the Old Testament law simply says, this is how you should be, this is what you should do. And it's absolute in the sense that you should do it because God says so. Not because there's a particular punishment if you don't, or this and this will happen if you don't, but rather the impetus for keeping the law is because of who God is. And that is taken to be enough, because, of course, if he is the supreme omnipotent God, then, well, that ought to be enough for us, doesn't it? There's also no distinction between religious life and secular life. You should behave this way according to the Law of Moses, because that's what God wants from you, and there's no distinction, whether in relation to God or whether in relation to your fellow man and woman. This is how you should behave, because this is the type of God that he is. That's quite different, again, to what we see in the law codes around, where there's this very clear distinction between a set of religious laws and a set of secular laws. The behavior of the individual is much more important. The behavior of the individual, as well as the society as a whole, is important in Old Testament law in a much clearer sense than is found elsewhere. And finally, there's a greater premium placed on the sanctity and the importance of human life, of all human life, in the Law of Moses. So surface similarities, but when we look at them closely, we can see that there are actually some really quite fundamental distinctions. Let's talk about the creation account, and there are a number of ancient creation accounts, and I want to talk about one, which is Enuma Elish, ancient Babylonian account that was recorded on 6 tablets. And I'm using here some of the analysis of John Oswalt, again, the book that I quoted earlier, just to make the comparison between Genesis and Enuma Elish. Now, I've put this quote at the top: biblical tradition aligns with the traditional tenets of Babylonian science. So that's the sort of thing that you might read in a commentary. This is a classic commentary written by a chap called Speiser, commentary on Genesis. And of course, you read that and, if you're not a scholar, you may not have any particular basis to, you just accept that because the scholar said so. Oh, this is like what the Babylonians believed about creation. And again, that sort of, well, there's nothing to see here. This is just another of the ancient creation myths that we don't need to believe. Well, is it? How much like the account in Genesis is Enuma Elish? So it's quite interesting to consider that question. So there are certainly some similarities. Light is created in Genesis. Light comes from the gods. In Enuma Elish, there is a firmament. There's the emergence of dry land. There's the sun, moon, and the stars. There's the creation of man. There are some similarities, but are the two accounts really saying anything remotely similar? Well, let's have a look at this. So this is how the account in Enuma Elish unfolds. So first of all, the emergence of the gods from chaos is described, and Tiamat, who is the god of chaos, sea monster, plans to kill the other gods who have emerged from that chaos, and that takes up 160 lines. Is there anything like that in Genesis? And the answer to that is no. Marduk is selected as the champion of those gods, and that's another 130 lines. Does that have a parallel with Genesis? And the answer is no. The next 138 lines are taken up with the reasons for Marduk's supremacy. Again, there's no parallel with Genesis in that. Then the destruction of Tiamat is described in 134 lines. And since Tiamat, so the word the deep, meaning, the seas, it does occur in Genesis, and that is a related word to the word Tiamat. But in Genesis, it's just the seas. It's not a chaos monster that is described. It's just the deep, the seas, that is described. So there is no corresponding destruction of Tiamat in Genesis. So we're now something like 580 odd lines into Enuma Elish, and we haven't yet found any material similarities with Genesis. Now here we have, in 5 lines, something that perhaps is a bit more similar, and which is often pointed to in the commentators. Tiamat, now having been destroyed, this great sea monster, her body is split into 2, which make up the upper waters and the lower waters. And indeed, in Genesis, there is a dividing or a separating between the upper waters and the lower waters, but that's about it for the extent of the similarity. There is no monster whose body is split. God simply and calmly divides the waters above from the waters below, and he divides the water so that the dry land can appear in Genesis chapter 1. So yes, there's kind of a similarity, but it's completely different as well. Then in the Enuma Elish, we have the placement of the gods in the heavens, which takes up 27 lines. Now, is there anything like that in Genesis? And the answer again is no. We do have God placing the sun and moon, but Genesis doesn't even use the words sun and moon. It uses the greater light and the lesser light. So keen it is to emphasize that these are not gods that should be worshipped, but they are simply the sun and the moon, and he made the stars also. They are placed in the heavens, but again, how different it is. And then we have this broken tablet where a lot of the assumed parallels occur, but do you see how the parallels are based on a reconstruction of what we think that tablet says? Marduk, who's the chief god, makes man from mud and blood, and it's true that in Genesis God does form man from the dust of the ground, but there's no reference to blood, and we have instead this breathing in of the breath of life, and a man becomes a living soul. Let me just stop sharing at that point. But it's, again, one of the things that's really interesting is not just the way in which God is this supreme, all-powerful creator, and there is no threat to him and no counterpart to him in Genesis, but also what Genesis says about man and woman is very different, because in relation to the other creation accounts, man is an afterthought made to entertain the gods, or because the gods were hungry and they needed someone to feed them. It's completely the opposite. Now that, of course, is not a very empowering narrative for human beings, is it? That we're just there as kind of entertainment or to feed the gods. The Genesis narrative is massively empowering of human beings, because it places the creation of man and woman last, in the climactic place, to emphasize the uniqueness of man and woman as the pinnacle of God's creation, and to emphasize that how they behave actually does matter. So we've talked about the law codes briefly. We've talked about the creation account and how different Genesis is. And we've got two final topics to cover. One is circumcision, and the other is a quick look at the principles of sacrifice and ritual in the Old Testament. So we've seen we've seen in both cases of the law codes and the creation accounts that, although there are surface similarities, the underlying worldview is very different. Circumcision then is an interesting one. So circumcision is practiced by Jews, and that's initially recorded in Genesis chapter 17. Now, it turns out in the surrounding cultures at the time, some of them practiced circumcision and some of them didn't. So the fact that the Jews chose to circumcise is not itself unique. And so that's just a fact. However, the reason why they did, the reason why circumcision was instituted, according to the Bible in Genesis 17, is completely different to what was taking place in the cultures around. So, now again, I'm not a great expert in ancient circumcision practices and why different cultures did that, but in reading a bit about this, it's usually thought that circumcision is was generally carried out around puberty, and that it was actually like a rite of passage from being a minor or a junior to becoming a man. And in a way, it was a symbol or an opening up of potency. You're a man now. And circumcision is actually seen as a pruning rite to ensure the fertility and fruitfulness of the boy who is now a man, who may now go into the world and procreate. Now, in Genesis 17, it's almost the exact opposite of that when Abraham, who is now so old he can't have children anyway, and his wife is so old that she can't have children, and it's become increasingly obvious that it's impossible for Abraham and Sarah to have children by any natural means. At that point, Abraham is told to do one further thing, to cut off the part of his body that more than any other might be the part that would symbolize human fruitfulness and the human ability to procreate. And he's told to cut off a part of that part of his body in order to symbolize the utter inability of human beings to bring about God's promises. The only way in which Abraham can have a son and which God's promises can be fulfilled is if he actually stops trusting in himself and symbolically cuts off his ability to do so. So that's really interesting, and it's emphasizing the point then. Circumcision then becomes a symbol of God's covenant or God's special promises and relationship with Abraham and his children, that everything that God had promised would come about because God said it would be so, not because of anything that Abraham would or could do. And that's quite a deep theological point, isn't it? That's really quite profound. And then when we come later into, we read later on through the Bible, again, this part of the body is taken as a symbol flesh, of humanity at its worst, if you like, and we're told to cut that part of us off, to not rely on our own strength, our own macho abilities, anything that might be associated with toxic masculinity. That is in effect what is being cut off in this symbol. So it's kind of the very opposite of what the cultures around were doing, even though it's a similar act carried out at a very different time, when the child was actually just a baby at 8 days old. So another surface similarity, but a deep distinction. Finally, I want to just touch briefly on sacrifice. Now, again, sacrifice and ritual is a massive subject, so this is going to be really high level. But again, in the ancient world, there were lots of people offering sacrifices. So to offer a sacrifice itself, of course, is not unique at all, right? Cultures in completely different parts of the world, like the Aztecs, were offering sacrifice as well, of course. And there are many reasons, notionally, why you might, in some religious system or other, choose to offer sacrifices. So you may believe that your God is hungry and needs feeding, or your God needs to, be sustained by the blood of the sacrifice. You may want to make a gift to the god, and the sacrifice might be seen as that. But that isn't. None of those are the reasons why sacrifice is offered in the Bible, and it's another aspect of its uniqueness. We've talked a little bit about that realm of the gods amongst the ancient cultures in this world of mythology and the human world, but there was also belief that there was this sort of meta-divine realm in between, the world of demons, and that you could, by offering sacrifice, you could manipulate the demons, who would in turn then motivate or manipulate the gods in order to make it rain or get what you wanted to happen. The Bible reverses that whole thing and says, no, it's not about some other realm, the realm of the demons or the realm of the other gods. It's actually, the demons actually are inside you. It's actually your own human nature. It's actually human sinfulness. The fact that we are, self-seeking rather than God-seeking, or rather than seeking the best interests of others. That's where the problem is. So the problem isn't some god having a battle with some other god, or some god that's gone away on an adventure, that's not it. Because what those explanations do, they root the problem somewhere else. Again, the Bible is empowering and brings accountability to human beings, because it says, actually, no, you've got to look inside yourself. And that's where the problem is, and that's what needs to be addressed, and that's what needs to change, and that's what needs to be forgiven. And sacrifices were offered in order to remind the offerers that was the case, and in order to seek forgiveness and to seek covering from God for that. So that's it. We've covered a lot of ground. We've tried to see a fundamental difference in worldview between what the polytheistic cultures around were doing with their low view of gods and the low view of human nature, and how that's completely different to the biblical world view, with the supreme God and his high expectations of us and his empowering of us in saying that actually our behavior does make a difference. And then we've looked at 4 examples of some of those surface similarities and that underlying difference. And I hope that's been interesting and is just another little piece of the jigsaw, really, that just emphasizes how unique the Bible is, and how unique the God that we meet there is, and how unique his plan and his invitation for human beings to engage with him is. Thanks very much.